Japanese pilots believed they understood every weakness of American bombers. Their machine guns, formations, and attack angles had been perfected through countless engagements. But on one quiet morning over the Pacific, they approached a lone American aircraft expecting an easy victory, until the rear gunner performed a strange, hopeless trick they had never seen before, a move that defied logic and stunned the entire squadron. The Pacific skies in 1943 carried a deceptive stillness. Clouds drifted in soft layers, sunlight broke through in scattered beams, and the distant ocean shimmered like polished metal. Japanese fighter squadrons moved confidently across these skies, believing they possessed absolute dominance in one-on-one engagements. Their Zero fighters were fast, agile, and lethal, especially against slow American bombers. American crews knew this well. Every mission carried the weight of that imbalance. On this particular morning, a lone American medium bomber, returning from a reconnaissance run, found itself separated from its formation due to engine trouble. The pilot maintained level flight, trying to coax more power from an engine that responded with uneven vibrations. Fuel burn was higher than expected, altitude dropped slowly, and radio contact faded in and out. Still, the crew remained calm. They had been in worse conditions before. What they did not know was that a Japanese squadron had already spotted them. The Zeros approached from above in a shallow V formation, their pilots expecting a swift engagement. To them, this encounter promised nothing unusual. A straggling American bomber, damaged and alone, represented the easiest possible victory. In the rear compartment, the American tail gunner adjusted his harness, tightened his gloves, and scanned the horizon. He had engaged Japanese fighters before, but this time felt different, quieter somehow. He noticed something odd in the clouds behind the approaching Zeros, a brief flicker of reflective light, like the flash of metal or glass, appearing for a fraction of a second before disappearing. It was subtle, unexplainable, and positioned exactly where no aircraft should have been. He blinked, unsure if it was a trick of the morning sun. There was no time to dwell on it. The Japanese fighters descended in perfect unison, preparing their first pass. The tail gunner knew he could not outshoot them. His gun's range was limited. The bomber was losing altitude, and the enemy aircraft were faster than anything he could hope to track consistently. So he decided to try something that seemed impossible, something no manual had taught, something that felt reckless, even hopeless. Yet within minutes, this strange maneuver would shock an entire Japanese squadron and turn a doomed encounter into one of the most unexpected reversals of the Pacific Air War. The first sign of danger came as a faint shimmering line across the northern horizon, just visible through the tail gunner's sighting glass. At first, it resembled no more than a mirage, heat shimmer bending sunlight above the distant sea. But as seconds passed, the shimmer resolved into shapes. 3, then 5, then 7 aircraft, each maintaining an exact spacing that revealed their disciplined formation. The gunner steadied his breath, leaning slightly into the turret's padded frame. The bomber vibrated beneath him, the troubled engine sending rhythmic pulses through the fuselage. He adjusted his harness again, tightening it more from habit than necessity. The familiar scent of heated metal and machine oil filled the compartment, grounding him in the reality of the moment. He tapped the intercom switch. Contact réel. Multiple zeros. Closing fast. Static crackled before the pilot's voice came through, strained but controlled. Copy. Hold position. Keep them honest. The bomber continued its shallow descent, forced by the failing engine to maintain a lower altitude than ideal. The pilot manipulated the throttle with careful pressure, hoping to preserve what power remained. In the waist compartment, the crew felt the subtle shift in tension, the calm before engagement. The Japanese formation maintained a steady approach, each Zero positioned with near-perfect precision. Their lead pilot examined the bomber through his forward canopy, assessing distance and angle. He noted the declining altitude and the engine exhaust shimmering unevenly, clear evidence of damage. The American aircraft seemed incapable of evasive maneuvering, making it an ideal target. The tail gunner exhaled slowly, centering his aim point. But he did not fire. The Zeros were still too distant, and every bullet wasted now would matter later. He studied their pattern instead, identifying not only their spacing, but the sequence of movements that usually preceded their attack runs. Then he saw it again, a faint flicker, like a metallic blink, reflecting from the clouds behind the Japanese aircraft. It was small, brief, and came from no identifiable object. There were no other American planes in the area, no sunlight angles that could produce such concentrated light, and no reason for something reflective to appear at that height. It vanished before he could trace it, leaving a subtle unease that pulled at the edges of his concentration. The Zeros continued closing the distance. Their engines produced a rising chorus that pierced the morning air with a high, unwavering pitch. Slowly, deliberately, they began to fan out, preparing the classic bracket maneuver, one of the most feared Japanese tactics. Two fighters would descend on the tail, two more approaching diagonally from the sides, while the lead pilot coordinated timing from the upper angle. The gunner recognized the pattern instantly. He had survived this maneuver before, barely, and knew the cycle. The enemy would pepper the tail with short bursts to force suppression, then shift positions rapidly to hit blind spots. Against a lone bomber, the tactic was brutally effective. He rotated the turret, tracking the descending arc of the nearest Zero. His finger hovered near the trigger. His breathing deepened, not from fear, but from focus, the kind that only comes from understanding exactly how dangerous a moment truly is. The formation tightened. The first Zero dipped into attack position. The gunner's heartbeat slowed, and then the sky erupted into motion. The Japanese fighters closed in with calculated precision, their synchronized descent creating an almost geometric pattern in the sky. From his turret, the American tail gunner watched the approaching silhouettes, each one gliding along a predictable arc used countless times against vulnerable bombers. The formation was perfect, too perfect. Each movement reflected practiced confidence, the kind that left no room for hesitation. The gunner tightened his grip on the handles, steadying his breath as he tracked the lead Zero's subtle banking motion. His heart did not race. Instead, his focus deepened, narrowing the world into a series of angles, distances, and possible outcomes. He had survived tight engagements before, but this one felt different. Not because of fear, but because of the strange flicker he had seen earlier. It lingered at the back of his mind like a question intentionally left unanswered. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. They're lining up, braced for their first run. The tail gunner responded with a brief click of acknowledgement. Words felt unnecessary. The Zeros continued tightening their formation. When a moment came, it arrived with the sharp, sudden clarity of a spotlight switching on. The lead fighter dipped into a shallow dive, his wingmen adjusting their positions in perfect response. One shifting left, one right, another drifting downward to cut off escape routes. This was the technique the Japanese called Kakioka no go kai, the folding wings maneuver, designed to overwhelm a bomber's defensive guns by creating simultaneous attack vectors. It was fast, coordinated, and devastating. The gunner had seconds to act, but instead of firing immediately, he did something that went against every instinct drilled into him during training. He let go of the trigger, and he moved the turret away from the nearest Zero. To an outside observer, the action would have seemed reckless, suicidal even. The obvious target was the closest attacker, already lining up for a burst that could shred the rear fuselage. A gunner was expected to return fire instantly, to disrupt the enemy's aim, to force them offline. Yet the American gunner deliberately swung the turret several degrees off target, as though tracking something beyond the fighter formation. The Japanese pilots saw this, and for a split second, they faltered. It made no sense. Their approach was flawless. The bomber was losing altitude. The gunner should have been fully engaged, yet he appeared distracted, locked onto something behind them, something they could not see. The memory of the strange flicker in the clouds surfaced again, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The gunner didn't know what it was, didn't understand it, but he realized something crucial. The Japanese pilots had also seen the direction of his turret, and they assumed he knew something they didn't. The lead Zero hesitated, adjusting his dive just enough to widen the angle. Another, confused by the gunner's unexpected aim, shifted prematurely to a side approach. In their doctrine, unnecessary corrections broke formation discipline. Yet now, small corrections echoed across the formation like discordant notes in a once perfect rhythm. The gunner seized the moment. With the fighters misaligned, he swung the turret back toward the nearest Zero with sudden, fierce precision. The move was so abrupt that the Japanese pilot, already committed to a shallower dive, found himself directly in the gunner's line of fire. The gunner squeezed the trigger. A controlled burst erupted from the twin .50 caliber barrels, stitching a bright arc across the morning sky. The round struck the Zero's right wing, punching through metal and fuel lines with heavy, tearing impacts. The aircraft jolted violently, smoke trailing from the ruptured panel. The formation collapsed. Two fighters veered off prematurely, avoiding the debris. Another dove too sharply, breaking alignment. The perfect attack sequence shattered, not because of firepower, but because the gunner's strange, hopeless-looking maneuver had manipulated their expectations. As the damaged Zero spiraled downward, the gunner exhaled slowly. The trick had worked, but the Japanese squadron had only begun to understand what they were up against. The damaged Zero spiraled away from the bomber, trailing a thin ribbon of smoke that twisted through the morning air like a dark thread unraveling from a tighter weave. The remaining Japanese pilots watched the descent with a mix of disbelief and sharpened focus. The formation had been structured to eliminate uncertainty, yet uncertainty was now spreading through it like a silent current beneath the surface. The tail gunner remained motionless for a moment, his turret settling into a steady rhythm after the recoil of the burst. He kept his eyes trained on the shifting formation, searching for the next sign of movement. Beneath his calm exterior, he felt a keen awareness, an understanding that his unexpected maneuver had created a ripple that disrupted the Japanese attack cycle. The pilot's voice emerged through the intercom, low and controlled. "Good hit, but they're regrouping. Expect another run." The gunner acknowledged with a short breath. He knew that a single successful burst rarely deterred an experienced Zero squadron. If anything, it sharpened their intent. Yet something else tugged at the edges of his concentration, the lingering question of the strange light flicker in the clouds. He glanced upward just briefly, enough to notice the faintest glimmer once again. It was softer now, barely more than a pinprick in the haze, but unmistakably there. It didn't move like an aircraft, didn't pulsate like sunlight through vapor, and didn't behave like a reflection from the bomber's own surfaces. It remained quietly, as though observing. He forced himself to refocus. The Japanese squadron restructured itself quickly, but not flawlessly. The loss of one aircraft had altered their spacing, forcing the remaining pilots to adjust. These adjustments created micro-delays, small hesitations that widened the reaction time between them. The lead pilot, determined not to let the American crew exploit the disruption, signaled a shift in attack sequencing. Instead of a bracket maneuver, They would now execute a deceptive feint followed by a crossing attack. It was a more aggressive approach meant to regain psychological control. Two Zeros descended sharply toward the bomber, guns flashing in short bursts meant to force suppression. The gunner tracked them, but did not fire yet. He knew their true attack was coming from elsewhere. A third Zero dove at a steeper angle, using the sun's glare as partial concealment. Its pilot waited for the gunner to commit to the nearer threats before striking. It was a tactic refined over years of combat experience, one designed to exploit predictable defensive behavior. But the American gunner, whether through instinct, experience, or the lingering awareness of that strange flicker behind the formation, refused to be predictable. He ignored the closer fighters, letting their rounds spark harmlessly along the exterior plating. Instead, he focused on the sunlit arc where the third Zero's descent would intersect. And there it was. The gleam appeared again, this time reflecting faintly off the descending Zero's wingtip. It wasn't the mysterious flicker itself, but the way light around it played across the metal surface. The contrast revealed the fighter's line of approach with perfect clarity. The gunner waited until the last possible moment. When the Zero emerged from the haze, expecting a blind angle, it found itself directly in his sights. He squeezed the trigger. The burst tore through the morning air, and the round struck the Zero's forward fuselage. The fighter jolted, its canopy fracturing. The pilot attempted to pull up, but the damage had compromised control surfaces. Seconds later, the aircraft dipped into a downward spiral, disappearing into a cloud layer far below. The other Zeros, seeing two of their own downed in moments, hesitated again. Not because of firepower, not because of the bomber's strength, but because they sensed something was wrong, deeply wrong, with this engagement. The American gunner had anticipated their moves before they fully executed them. His reactions felt unnaturally precise, as though he could see beyond the limits of normal awareness. One Japanese pilot glanced toward the clouds where the strange flicker had seemed to originate earlier. He saw nothing, yet unease spread through him like a faint chill. The formation regrouped again, but now, for the first time, with hesitation. The battle was no longer unfolding according to their expectations. For several seconds, the sky held an unsteady stillness, as if the air itself absorbed the shock of the second Zero spiraling downward. The formation's once precise geometry loosened, the pilots adjusting instinctively rather than cohesively. They were still dangerous, still agile, but something fundamental had changed. The rhythm of their attack had faltered. The American pilot sensed it first. "Tail, they're not pushing as hard," he said through the intercom, breath measured but tight. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." The gunner didn't respond immediately. His focus tunneled into the shifting patterns ahead, where three Zeros now hovered at slightly irregular intervals. The once sharp synchronization that defined Japanese squadron tactics had frayed. The pilots exchanged subtle signals, wing rolls, shallow yaws, trying to reassert control, but their movements lacked the crisp confidence of earlier. Part of that hesitation stemmed from the gunner's unexpected precision. But deeper than that, something else lingered in their thoughts. A few of the Japanese pilots had glimpsed the same faint flicker in the clouds that the gunner had noticed, the brief, inexplicable glint that appeared in the exact place where no supporting aircraft should exist. It wasn't bright enough to be a threat, nor consistent enough to be a reflection they could explain. Yet the human mind, especially in combat, fills uncertainties with imagined possibilities. Was another American aircraft nearby? Was a second bomber hiding in the haze? Was the gunner tracking something they couldn't see? These questions settled into the edges of their awareness, altering their instincts. One of the Zeros advanced cautiously, adjusting his line of attack to probe the bomber's defenses rather than commit fully. He dipped his nose, then lifted it slightly, repeating the pattern as though testing the gunner's reaction. The gunner did not fire. He let the fighter approach just enough to reveal its true angle. Then he acted. A sharp rotation of the turret aligned his barrels with the Zero's outer vector. Not the fighter itself, but the space it would cross in the next second. The gunner didn't chase the aircraft. He predicted its path. When the Zero slid into that narrow arc of fire, the gunner pressed the trigger. The burst caught only the edge of the fighter's fuselage, but even a partial hit at that range caused immediate disruption. The Zero dropped lower, stabilizing, but the damage forced it out of the attack sequence. The remaining fighters reacted with mixed impulses, aggression from training, caution from uncertainty. The lead pilot, recognizing the breakdown of momentum, signaled for a regroup on his wing. The squadron began to reassemble, abandoning the multi-angle pressure that had given them supremacy earlier. They reorganized into a tighter, more traditional line-abreast formation, perhaps believing a direct, coordinated sweep would succeed where the more complex maneuver had failed. But in tightening their formation, they made themselves predictable. The American gunners' breathing slowed again. He watched their wings align, their altitudes matching, their flight paths syncing. He rotated his turret slightly upward, not firing, simply tracking. The bomber's vibrations steadied beneath him, a quiet reminder of the fragile balance holding them aloft. Then, for the fourth time, the flicker appeared. This time, it was brighter, just for an instant, glinting across the upper haze like a coin catching sunlight. The gunner saw it. One Japanese pilot saw it too. Their eyes tracked the same point in the clouds. And for the first time, the Japanese formation broke in two directions. Not from damage, not from fire, but from something the pilots could not fully explain. Two Zeros banked right. One climbed abruptly. The leader hesitated, caught between discipline and instinct. That moment of hesitation, no longer than a heartbeat, opened a gap in their spacing. A gap the gunner immediately exploited. He fired another burst. Not long, not reckless, simply precise. The rounds passed through the widening gap and clipped the tail of the climbing Zero, sending it into a destabilizing wobble. Though not downed, the fighter fell out of position entirely. The lead pilot finally realized the truth that had been building quietly across the engagement. This was no ordinary gunner, and this was no ordinary encounter. The skies had shifted, and now the Japanese squadron was reacting instead of dictating. The Japanese formation, once the embodiment of precision and harmony, now moved with a tension that reflected the inner uncertainty of its pilots. The lead Zero held its position with disciplined steadiness, but the subtle deviations among the wingmen betrayed the strain taking hold. Each pilot attempted to reassert control, to rebuild the rhythm that had carried them through so many successful engagements. Yet something intangible pressed against their confidence, a presence they couldn't name, a pattern they couldn't decipher. Inside the bomber's tail compartment, the American gunner maintained a stillness that contrasted with the turbulence around him. His turret glided with deliberate purpose, never jerking, never hesitating, as though the chaos outside existed in a different world entirely. He did not smile, did not tense, did not celebrate the hits he had already made. His entire focus centered on the shifting geometry of the fight, the angles, the distances, the seconds between decisions. The intercom crackled again. "How we look back there?" the pilot asked. The gunner replied quietly, "They're confused. Keep us steady." Ahead of them, the Japanese squadron prepared for what their leader hoped would be the decisive run. He signaled a staggered attack pattern, one that relied less on coordinated timing and more on overwhelming pressure. The fighters would approach in a rolling sequence, each attempting to force the gunner into reactive bursts that would drain his ammunition and fracture his defensive rhythm. The lead Zero initiated the maneuver. He dipped sharply left, then rolled right, executing a shallow spiral intended to disrupt the gunner's aim. The gunner tracked him, but did not fire. He sensed the trick, the attempt to bait early shots, and waited. A second Zero rushed in from a lower angle, then a third from above. Their converging arcs tightened around the bomber like the closing jaws of a trap. Still, the gunner didn't fire. Not yet. The flicker appeared again, this time directly above the lead Zero. A brief flash, softer than before, but positioned in a way that momentarily caught the attention of both the gunner and the Japanese pilot. The lead pilot lifted his head instinctively, just for a fraction of a second, searching for the source of the light. In aerial combat, a fraction of a second is everything. The gunner seized the moment. He swung the turret, not toward the lead Zero, but toward the fighter breaking from the upper right arc, the one whose dive path had been perfectly synchronized until the formation fractured. His instinct, or whatever guided him, had read the pattern before it fully emerged. He squeezed the trigger, releasing a long, controlled burst. The round sliced through the air with unwavering precision. The Zero rolled violently, smoke bursting from its engine cowling. The pilot fought for control, but couldn't recover. He plunged through a cloud layer and vanished from sight. With the upper right fighter gone, the staggered pattern collapsed. The lead Zero aborted his run. A wingman pulled away to avoid collision. Another broke formation entirely, banking hard into an evasive climb. The Japanese pilots, despite their skill, found themselves reacting rather than executing, a reversal of roles they had rarely experienced. For a moment, no one fired. The Japanese squadron hovered in fractured arcs, their formations pulled apart by a chain of decisions that none of them could fully understand. The bomber, limping but steady, continued on its path, its gunner watching them with unwavering patience. The lead pilot, breathing heavily, studied the bomber below him. He tried to reconstruct the engagement, each maneuver, each burst of fire, each misalignment. None of it made sense. A damaged bomber should not have outmaneuvered them. A lone gunner should not have disrupted a squadron. And no American aircraft should have been positioned where that strange flicker appeared. The gunner, still tracking their movements, felt the weight of the moment settling into quiet inevitability. He wasn't winning through firepower. He wasn't overpowering them. He was unsettling them, tilting the balance with each unexpected decision, each precise reaction, each refusal to behave predictably. The Japanese leader finally realized the truth. They could continue the fight, but not the strategy. Their formation was broken, their advantage gone. One by one, the Zeros turned away, climbing into the haze, regrouping at a distance they felt was safe enough to prevent further losses. The bomber, battered but intact, flew steadily onward, unescorted, outnumbered, yet victorious in a way no one aboard had anticipated. The strange flicker in the clouds faded with the retreating fighters, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. But the impression it left, on both sides, remained. As the last of the Japanese fighters disappeared into the haze, the air around the bomber settled into a calm that felt almost unreal. The engines still throbbed unevenly. The fuselage quivered with every change in altitude, and the scent of burned metal drifted faintly through the aircraft. Yet the sky, once crowded with coordinated threats, now stretched open and quiet, offering the crew a moment of clarity they had not expected to survive. The pilot exhaled slowly. "Tay, are you still with us?" The gunner responded with a soft, steady breath. "Still here." He rotated the turret gently, scanning the horizon, not in fear of a renewed attack, but in acknowledgement of the silence that followed. The bomber remained damaged, their journey home uncertain, but the immediate threat had passed. The crew exchanged quiet glances through narrow compartments, each man absorbing the reality of what had just occurred. None of them had seen a squadron break formation like that before. None had watched Zero pilots abandon an engagement they should have dominated. And none fully understood how one gunner had managed to disrupt not just their attack patterns, but their confidence. When the bomber finally linked with friendly forces hours later, their report spread quickly among intelligence officers. The gunner's hopeless trick, the deliberate misdirection of his turret, the uncanny timing of his bursts, and his ability to anticipate attack angles, became a subject of immediate study. Some analysts credited experience. Others suggested instinct sharpened by stress. A few quietly noted the mention he made of a faint reflective flicker in the clouds, though none knew what to make of it. It remained a footnote in the official report, too subtle, too uncertain to classify, yet too unusual to ignore entirely. Japanese accounts from that morning, recovered long after the war, revealed a similar curiosity. Some pilots mentioned a brief reflection in the upper haze, a light that appeared and vanished without explanation. Most dismissed it as atmospheric distortion. Yet a few, writing in personal journals rather than formal records, described a feeling that the American gunner had been reacting to something unseen. In the end, the truth mattered less than the outcome. A damaged bomber survived. A disciplined Japanese squadron retreated. And a single gunner, relying on instinct and a moment of improvisation, rewrote an encounter that should have ended differently. The skies gave no final answer to the flicker that lingered above the battle. But the men who lived through it remembered it, quietly, privately, as though some part of the morning had belonged to something beyond tactics, beyond training, and beyond understanding. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.